Greetings, Graphite community and friends of open source creative tools. Join me as we embark on a little tour of our latest and largest release to date, as Graphite nears the end of its alpha development phase and prepares to enter beta in just the next few months. If you're new to Graphite, it is our open source community-driven answer to the increasingly monopolistic landscape of 2D creative applications. It is today a vector editor, but moving rapidly towards becoming a raster editor, a compositor, an animation tool, and a photo editor, as well as everything else involving design and art. Instead of hand-drawing everything using a destructive editing approach, it allows you to create non-destructive, reusable workflows and share those with others. Since Graphite does not follow a regularly scheduled release model, we have updates from May all the way through September. During that time, we have made over 300 changes, with 100 of those focused on bugs, crashes, and defects, 50 focused on implementing the native desktop application that is coming along well and should be released before the end of this year. And we have 50 commits focused on infrastructure and GPU-accelerated rendering, which will allow your graphics card to put full power towards rendering your artwork. Additionally, we have finished hosting our second year of students in the Google Summer of Code program, where our project had 5 interns working on a number of contributions that will be covered throughout this presentation. We should first announce a couple community events. If you're in the California Bay Area, come to the Maker Faire and visit us at our booth, September 26th through 28th. And if you are in Europe, come attend our first in-person community meetup in Karlsruhe, Germany on Friday, October 10th. Jumping straight in, we will begin by talking about changes to the data format and rendering technology that Graphite has worked on as a major focus for this release. So far, Graphite has been built with the idea that the node graph processes data from left to right, giving a single item such as an image or a vector shape as its data that flows through the graph. But as we have been designing further, we've realized that what really needs to happen is Graphite needs to process lists of data, not just a single item, but multiple items. For example, if you're going to create a circle, and then you're going to repeat it, now you don't just have one circle anymore, you have 4 of them, or you can change this to any number that you want. But previously, we would have to produce a group, and then your data would go from being vector to being a less pure form of data, which is a group which could also be mixed in with raster, it could be mixed in with other groups. You wouldn't be able to apply nodes that were specific just to vector. So an example is points to polyline. Previously, this would not have been possible because it would have had to apply to green data, that's the group data. And this group data, as we can see, we get a type error, would not have worked because only the blue data contains vector, but green data is not guaranteed to contain vector, and points to polyline is a vector effect. This has been a major refactor that has taken several months to complete, and there are still a few lingering side effects that you may need to be aware of. At the moment, if you have the select tool active and you click on a layer, such as this layer, we end up only having the selection box around item 0, that is this item, the first one in the table, when the goal is to actually have the bounding box around all of them. But that is going to take additional work to get the tools so they can start applying to individual rows. So for example, if I wanted to click on this layer and then double click to select one item and move just that one item, it would actually apply a filtered transformation to that one item that got selected through a double click. That will be an upcoming feature to look forward to, but at the moment it will mean that you have to select the first item out of potentially multiple. Please be aware that this also means that any documents you created previously, which involved transformations, there are some cases where the transformations do not behave identically. This might mean that something you've created in the past will look a little different when you upgrade it. That will mean you may need to open the document and make some changes to it to get the transformations back to working as they were. Moving along, the next item in the list is that we can now drive a layer with a color. This allows you to now use this as a background color. For example, if you wanted to draw on some kind of beige paper-looking color, you could then do all your drawings on top of this and use this base layer, which you might choose to lock using the lock button, even if you want to benefit from an infinite canvas. The way that this works in the node graph is that we simply have a color value directly passing the data into the layer underneath. Moving along to the next feature, we now have rendering with layer clipping. The way that this works is that you can simply draw one layer on top of another, and if you hold down the Alt key and click on the border between them like this, we now have created a clipping mask that clips the content of this to wherever the one beneath it is visible, and it excludes it from everywhere that it's not visible. To provide one more example, we can draw this squiggle with a brush. Then we can use the shape tool and draw some kind of shape like this, and now we can clip the shape on top and have it only visible where the squiggle was shown. Now I can turn the fill to 0 here, And now I've made it so the shape is only visible wherever the squiggle is shown. Moving along again, but reusing that surfboard, let's actually hide these other two layers or get rid of them entirely. And we're just going to work on the outline. What if we want that outline to not go outside and inside? We just want it to go outside or only inside. Well, we now have this new stroke alignment, and that allows us to say that the stroke should be only inside or only outside, or we can go back to the default of being aligned to the center. Now, as I change this value, we can go in, or we can go out, and have it only showing where it belongs. Moving along, again, we have a situation with strokes with a new option. This allows us, if we would like, to draw the stroke, which normally appears on top and therefore covering up part of the fill. We can actually get that to draw behind by having the stroke below. And we can see that by turning the opacity down of the stroke color. Now it's being covered up entirely, even though it's partially transparent by the fill, but if we go back to stroke above, now it's above the fill and it's appearing partially transparent. This just adds additional flexibility that you may need for some of your artwork. And moving along again, as we saw earlier in these demonstrations, we now have the data panel. This is an upgraded version of the spreadsheet panel, which is much more powerful. If I click on a layer, now we will get the layer contents, and then we can click inside of that layer to view what that first row contained. And now this first row contains yet another first row, and inside of that, we have all the appearance information involved in the stroke for this vector geometry. So for example, we have a color for the fill, we have a color for the stroke, but the stroke is 0 pixels. We can see information on the dash length, the dash offset, stroke cap, stroke join, and basically everything else that is going towards making the stroke appear with certain properties. Then we can go to the points, segments, and the regions, and we can view all the data that's being shown there. Or we can go back out here, and we can view the transformation, or the blending information. So for example, the opacity is currently set to 100%, but if I reduce that, now we can see it's set to 40%. This is especially useful for viewing the procedural information that you might work with if you are using the node graph. So as I click on any node, such as assign colors, we can start out with all of these different light bulbs. And if I click on any of them, I can now view the color information that's been assigned to the different pieces. As we can see, this green is set by this part of the color here. This lets you not only view vector data, but also raster data. If I were to draw a brush stroke, and then I click on the raster data belonging to that, since this is the top layer, it gets added last, and therefore it appears last in the table. Now I can actually view that, and as I draw, this will in fact update as I go. It even lets you view color data, like as we see here, we have this color assigned. Now as I change it, it will update in the data panel to reflect the data that's being passed through the graph and being rendered. Lastly, since the data panel is accessed here through the window menu, we've made it possible to hide and show the properties and layer panels as well from that same menu. Moving on to talk about improvements to the node graph as a whole, we now have a significantly improved categorization of all the different nodes that are available within Graphite. This should make it easier to find what you're looking for. Moving on, but in a similar vein, we now have this menu here, which allows you to not only add, but also automatically sort by any types that are compatible for this. So since we are working with a layer that is vector, this is going to sort by anything that is of the type vector. This lets us now, for example, add a bevel node, which is compatible with the type vector, and change it here. That same menu is also available up here. Moving along, we also now have support in the node graph for simply dragging a node and shaking it to pull it out of the connection. And that goes along with our previous feature where you can drop it in and it will automatically connect it up for you, making it really easy to move nodes in and out of wires. Moving along, we now have a system that automatically converts the types between nodes. Previously, you would have constant type errors whenever dealing with numbers because there are different types of numbers, such as floating point, those are decimal numbers of both 32 and 64-bit sizes, and you also had integers of 32 and 64-bit sizes. Now, all of those get type converted automatically between one another, making it very easy. So for example, we can now have an instance repeat of 5 different versions of this box. We can take the index, multiply it to change the offset position, and also multiply it by this different value to drive the bevel amount. And we don't have to care about the number types anymore, we just have to plug them in and they'll automatically work with one another. And that allows us, for example, as the index increases, to bevel each one by a different amount incrementally from one another. Now we move on to changes about the drawing tools. It is now possible to draw multiple points that are single anchor points, but do not have any attached segments to them. And we now have a system that correctly draws these overlays where you can see them with both the select tool and with the path tool. And of course you can move them around. This is also important if you are generating geometry. So if you have a circle like this and you do the scatter points node, now the points that are scattered are actually shown here, which previously was not the case because they didn't have any segments that were connected to them. Moving on, we now have the path tool supporting the molding of segments. All you need to do is click and drag along a segment, and it will actually move the associated handles. If we show the handles, we can see that you are actually simply dragging both adjacent handles in unison. Moving on, the path tool now also supports point sliding. Simply hit GG, and you can now move it around. This feature is inspired by Blender, which has the same shortcut. Moving on, the pen tool, when vector meshes are enabled in the preferences, these are still experimental, we can now draw segments, and then, this is the new feature, you can actually insert a point on an existing segment. And now these three segments are connected by a shared anchor point. Previously, it would have the pen tool created a new anchor, but it did not insert it on the existing segment. Moving on, the path tool now has segment editing mode as well as point editing mode. If I go to segment editing mode, now I can select individual segments, and then I can drag the segments like this, or use R and S to rotate and scale them. This is also inspired by Blender, and we can also shift select and select both points and segments and move those at the same time. Moving on, the path tool now has support for selecting other objects besides the one that's already selected by double-clicking. Previously, this happened by single-clicking, and that made it difficult to box select specific points or to click on points that were right next to other objects. So now with a double-click, or you can shift double-click, you can transfer your selection or add multiple objects to the selection. Moving on, also in following with Blender shortcuts, we have added the tab key to jump between what is effectively the edit mode and object mode equivalent, which is the select tool and the path tool. However, this also follows industry standard keyboard shortcuts, which is the V key. You can think of a V as the shape of a pointer, and the A key, a capital A, is also the shape of a pointer, except upside down from a V. So V and A, but additionally now tab can cycle between the two. Moving on, the path tool now has added a button called Make Path Editable. This is important when you are using a node that modifies the path after the original path node. When the path node has some subsequent modification that's not part of the path node, such as this here, the changes that you can see are going to be applied to the path node, but you may want to actually edit the geometry of the resulting shape. The way to do that is by adding another path node. Previously, you had to do this manually. Now you can simply press that button and it has added a path node for me. What that allows me to do is make edits at this location and it's stored in the path node directly. This makes it much more discoverable. You can also delete the path node and it will return to the edits before you made those subsequent changes. Additionally, this has been added to the Layer Make Path Editable menu here. Moving on, the path tool has added the feature that you can copy and paste geometry or Control D to duplicate the geometry. Previously, this was not possible. Additionally, if you deselect the layer entirely, then with any tool selected, you can still paste the geometry, although it will be assigned a default style since it's no longer part of that original layer. Moving on, the polygon tool has now been renamed to the shape tool. And additionally, the similar line, rectangle, and ellipse tools have actually been under the hood unified into the same tool, but these icons, because they're so common, are given their own icons even though they are actually the same tool under the hood. And now you can select many different shapes from the tool instead of only a polygon or a star. So I can draw a circle, I can draw an arc, and this arc allows me to use these gizmos and change what the arc is. And additionally, you can do so from this panel here. You can also change it to have a closed or a pie slice. There is also a spiral, and there is also a grid. Please note that the grid rendering, because this involves a vector mesh where there are multiple segments connected to a single anchor, we have some rendering bugs that are present because that is not supported by SVG rendering by default. That has been the subject of one of the Google Summer of Code projects, which began research into this topic. Moving on, the Select tool has added the ability to see a distance on the X and the Y axis when you're dragging an object. Moving on, we have now added the ability to choose between having a custom pivot or no pivot at all if you don't want that yellow indicator. Or you can go to show the origin of the object. This has this icon instead, the sort of checkered ball. And now any rotation, scaling, or simply movement is all going to be based about that point. Now we move on to covering many improved and new nodes that are offered by Graphite. If we have a circularly repeated star, for example, we now have this new node called index. What this does is it will filter all the objects down to your object of choice. Similarly, a node called count elements has been added. This will allow you to see the number of elements that are shown. If I start out with a number like 1, 2, 3, and then I change the text to be fed from the node graph, I can take the output of this circular repeat, feed it into the text, and now I see that the number is 15. If I change the circular repeat, we can see 15, and as I increase it, the number will change as well. What this is doing is it is counting the number of rows of data that are visible. As we can see here, we have 24 rows. We also have a node that has been added called path length, and we feed the path into path length. We can see that the length of this path is currently 2005, but as I move it, it will update live. A new node has been added called cut path. What this does, as I choose a value from 0 to 1, is it will pick a point from 0 to 1 and cut the path at that location, creating two paths. If I jitter the points that are involved here, we can see as I move around, we now have two separate paths that are all individually being jittered because this path has been cut at that point. A similar node has been added called cut segments. What this does is it cuts each individual segment into its own subpath. As we can now see, every endpoint is not connected to any other endpoint, so each one is moving as its own segment in its own direction. The sample polyline node, which you might previously know as being called sample points, but it has been renamed now, has also added a separation or quantity. Separation has been the default before, telling yourself the distance between every point. So now every point here is 143 apart, but you can also request a number of points. So we would want 100 points on the resulting shape, and you can reduce that down to get a smaller number like 12. Both of them are useful in different tasks when you want a specific number or you want the number to change in order to reach a certain separation. We have added a new node called normalize, which takes a vec2, that is a magnitude in a direction, and it makes the length equal to 1. For example, if I take this circle from 0, 0 to any vec2 of our choice, and I want it to follow a circle, I can take the centroid location of that circle. This is a vec2 coming from the center of the circle, and I feed it into the endpoint. Now it follows the circle. I can also scale the length of that vec2 by multiplying it. Now, if I change it to this length, it will always be some proportion of the distance to the circle. But what if I want it to be a constant length? That's where this new node comes in, normalize. Before scaling it to some length like this, the normalize will make sure that it always has a length 1 before it then gets multiplied to be a length of the multiply value. A similar node has been added called length, which reports the length of the vector. Now as I drag the circle around, the line will have this length because that is the length of the vector from the centroid of this circle to the origin. New math nodes, greatest common denominator and least common multiple, have been added as well. Next up, the text node has added a parameter which allows you to separate each glyph into its own separate piece. If we open the data table, we now see that there are 22 rows, one for each of the 22 letters. This allows us to individually control each letter. We have added a loop level parameter to the instance repeat node. This allows you to do nested looping. This works by having the instance index with a loop level of 0 correspond to the inner loop, and the instance index with a level 1 correspond to the outer loop. You could also add additional levels of instance repeat, and each additional one would have a level above that, so 2 and 3 and so on. As we can see, the instance index of the inner loop is corresponding to the x-axis, and the outer loop is corresponding to the y-axis. We could also feed the x and y parameters here and have it so the width and the height of the ellipse is corresponding to each of the inner and outer loops. This makes it more powerful because previously you could only get the index of the innermost loop. A new section of transform nodes have been added under the math category. This allows you to decompose a rotation, decompose a scale, decompose a translation, invert a transform, extract a transform, and the transform node that we have had before has added the ability to also output a transform if it is receiving no input, or if it is receiving a transform as input, and use that downstream to output a transform rather than simply applying a transform to some other geometry. Some previous scattered nodes have been consolidated into the web request category, and some new ones have been added that allow you to decode an image, to load resources, turn a string into bytes, as well as making GET requests, turn an image into bytes, and the previous load image also allows you to load an image from a URL. This makes it possible to rasterize a document and make a request to a server that can, for example, display it on an LED installation, such as our open source booth that we hosted back in July. We have added a node called Separate Subpaths. This converts from having one vector element composed of multiple subpaths into having multiple vector elements, each that are a single subpath. You can now view the table containing all 8, instead of previously there being only one. That now makes it possible to use nodes such as assign colors and pick a random selection of colors to apply to each individual vector element. The transform node, when you give it angles for rotation and for skew, previously would only use degrees in the properties panel, but it used radians in the node graph. A value of 0 would then do a full rotation by reaching 6.2, which is approximately 2 pi radians. But here in the latest version, it has been made consistent, where rotation and skew are both given values in the node graph that also respects the 0 to 360 degree rotation range. Now the values you enter in the properties panel, and those which are calculated programmatically in the node graph, will match with the same values to avoid confusion. Boolean operations have been improved to be much more robust under different situations. The engine for typography has been improved. This has fixed some issues with character spacing, line height, and rendering of glyphs in other languages, including right-to-left languages like Arabic. Additionally, we have a per glyph faux italic tilt parameter, and now we can left align, center align, right align, and even justify text within a block. This makes it possible to design larger, complex layouts, such as a magazine spread shown here. Performance has been improved considerably since the last release. Panning in this document is now butter smooth. It previously was extremely slow. A performance mitigation has been added where thumbnails that have large complexity and take long to render have been replaced with a red slash, which will be the case until we can prioritize replacing the render pipeline that's used for these thumbnails with one that's just as fast as we have been working towards in the viewport. Most of the vector operation nodes that ran different algorithms that used to be very slow have been replaced with much faster algorithms that are implemented using a new library. These are often several hundred times faster. Additionally, performance viewing very large node graphs has been improved. Performance has also been improved working with large raster images. This barely slows down, while in the previous release it would very quickly become sluggish. In the previous release, dragging around this 4000 by 3000 high-resolution image would be very sluggish, while it's now almost completely real-time. Lastly, a few additions have been made to the website. One of them is in our code contributor documentation under editor structure. This is an auto-generated outline of our codebase's architecture. It allows new developers, as well as existing developers, to find their way through the code and all the different modules and components that make up the systems. If you've been thinking about getting started with contributing to Graphite, feel free to poke around this outline. And lastly, our donate page has been revamped with the addition of new statistics that update live based upon the number of contributions that we're receiving. These statistics are calculated based upon an average over the previous 3 months to smooth out some volatility. Graphite is still a relatively young project, so this is a small number, but over the coming years, we do hope to join the likes of Blender, which has been receiving about $250,000 a month, and Godot, which has been receiving about $250,000 a year in one-time donations and $36K each month. They both have full-time staff, and we hope that we can do the same in the future with your support. Thank you. With all those updates covered, and of course those were just the highlights, there were more than 300 commits in total in the past few months since the last release in May, the progress is not slowing down. Before we end, let's jump forward to see what's going to be worked on in the very near future. Here is a work-in-progress preview of the desktop application. This has been coming along nicely over the past couple months, but there is still a lot of work to do. We do expect to get that work completed before the end of the year. We've resisted simply throwing the web version of Graphite inside of its own little self-contained browser, since that wouldn't be a proper native desktop application. Graphite is architected and written in Rust as a native app, which means that the performance-sensitive code such as the editor logic and the rendering, that all runs natively, compiled to each operating system, without overhead from being in a browser. And of course, you can always check our progress on the website. Under the features section, we have a roadmap listed, and we have the desktop app, of course, but we are still nearing the end of getting the GPU-accelerated raster rendering working by default. Additionally, we are continuing to evolve the graphical data format even further. We have thus far adopted tables as the way that you can represent multiple pieces of data through the same piece of data flow, but that is going to continue evolving and moving towards also supporting a more robust vector mesh editing and rendering format. This will let you fill specific parts of multiple intersecting pieces of geometry and have it track what styles apply to each of those regions. We also have an animation panel going to be developed very soon that will allow you to do full keyframe animation instead of only driving things parametrically with time-based animation, which is how it works right now. And of course, as we march towards beta in the coming year, we will have many more features that you can peruse here and view what will happen during beta, and of course, once we get to our 1.0 release and beyond. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe for the next update, and share this with anyone who you think would be excited by what we're building. Until next time, keep up the creativity.